tonight, and they've told me I have really severe time limits, so I can't go on and on and on as I would normally do. What I'm going to do tonight is give us sort of an overview of, actually I'm going to start off with something you got a week or so ago on early formation, geologic formation of Ceiba, just so we got a ground plate that we started from. Then we're going to go through prehistory and the archaeology that's been done on Ceiba relating to the Amerindians and the first inhabitants. And then we're going to go into the historical period, a little overview of archaeology and history of Ceiba. But then the second half of the presentation is going to be about some archaeological research we did in April with the exhumation of 5 burials and the reburial of those remains in the cemetery. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So in order to get started, I guess I'm just going to have to go next. Oh no, I have the little buttony thing, don't I? Aha, there with the other hand. So there won't be any more actions with my hands. Okay, here we go. How it all began. For those of you who don't know, the Caribbean plate is situated between the North American and South American plates. And what happened is about 150 million years ago, the North American and South American plates were butted up against each other. And then the Nazca plate, coming from the Pacific Ocean, started to wedge in between the two plates. By 76 million years ago, it started to already push itself in between the two big plates, and scraping along. By 21 million, it had pushed all the way across. And at the barrier edge of this plate movement, it was forcing on the Atlantic plate in such a way that the island arc of the Caribbean islands got formed. It's right at that edge where you get all this volcanic magma at the breaking point where this is pushing up. What you also get, oh, I have a little button with this too. Here and here is where you get these big fault lines. So this is where big earthquakes have occurred and will continue to occur in the stretching side parts of this plate. And right along here is where the formation of the islands and the volcanic expressions. Volcanic activity, you can see classic, like in Statia, classic volcanic domes and features. Places like Dominica, St. Lucia, they have a lot of open volcanic visibility, but we want to talk about Ceiba a little bit tonight. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on geology, because you're here for archaeology, but it is important for you to know how much geology affects archaeology. Volcanic explosions are clearly going to affect a population living on this island. When it happened in prehistory, it would have had a very serious impact. What we can see, this is a study, even though it was done in 1961, by Westerman and Keel. This is still one of the fundamental geologic studies, particularly related to volcanism on the island of Ceiba. What we see is that the island, and I don't see my little red light there, okay? What we see, yep, there it is. With the entire island, it's not just one magma plume up through the middle. There actually are about 10 different magma plumes at different parts underneath the island of Ceiba. So that means if there were ever to be, or whenever there is another eruption, it might not just be at one spot, it could be at many different locations on the island. You will see areas like the Level, you see Booby Hill, you see over the features over above Fort Bay and by the bottom. So Great Hill and Parish Hill. So what you see is all these different uplifts, and of course the old lava flows, which became a flat point where the airport is. So that just gives you a little bit of a background about geologic formation of the island. There is another important point for you to understand about geology of the Eastern Caribbean in particular, and that is the difference between what's called the inner arc and the outer arc. This little pointer thing isn't doing its best. So the inner arc is this, from Grenada it comes up, and in Guadeloupe it splits and comes all the way up to Ceiba. The inner arc is active arc. There is active volcanism going on in the inner arc. The outer arc starts with the Basse-Terre part of Guadeloupe and goes up through Antigua, Barbuda, and over to Anguilla St. Martin. That is an ancient uplift. So it's basically dormant. So it doesn't have the same kind of volcanism life that the inner arc has. Okay. So, just sort of as a visual effect, I always like to put pretty pictures out. Everybody likes pretty pictures. And so as a visual effect, what you can see, this is on St. Martin, but it is exactly an example of what rocks look like when they boil up into the seafloor, into water. They form these breccia that are very rounded, smooth formations. As you can see here, and you can actually see the movement of how the lava was flowing under the seafloor as the islands were lifting up. And then of course they lift it up to a point where they start to decompose, soil forms, plant life comes, and then all of a sudden we start having life on the islands. When we look at 10 to 12,000 years ago, we know that the sea level was about 28 to 30 meters lower than it is now. It's one of the interglacial periods. That means that the area of this isn't really working, but St. Martin and Anguilla, at that time period, were one island. They were connected as one island mass. And that's as recently as 10 to 12,000 years ago, which is really quite substantial. When we look at the broader Caribbean, and we see this map, we can see the different coastlines that were existent at that time. And you'll see the state of Florida in the US is twice the size it is now. The Bahamas, instead of being thousands of islands, were basically 2 or 3. Okay, that's... Oh, yes. You see here, the Bahamas, instead of being thousands of islands, become large land masses. Central America extends out, Cuba. And look at here, the coastal islands in the southern part of the Caribbean, a lot of them become part of the mainland, like Aruba. And then we have our local formations. But Ceiba, and we're here to talk about Ceiba, but Ceiba was really a true oceanic island. It was the point that stuck out of the sea floor. Now, the first humans start coming into the Caribbean. We're sure the general areas we came from, where they came from. We're not always sure about the volume of human movement out of certain areas, but we know that they're coming from the south, from Central America, and particularly from South America. By 4000 BC, we've got full-blown populations living in Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, Haiti island. So we know that they've reached there by then. This first human inhabitation of the island is called the Archaic Age. It's basically called that because we don't have any ethnographic information about them to give them an ethnic name. So we kind of arbitrarily call it the Archaic Age. It is an age of hunter-gatherer fishing folk. They have not developed agriculture, and they do not know the manufacture of ceramics. So in the archaeological record, we don't find ceramics and we don't find agricultural tools. This is an artist rendering. They depended very heavily on natural environment features, caves, rock shelters to live in. Hunting and gathering and fishing, as I said. Now, across the Caribbean, one of the interesting things with the Archaic Age is that they are traditionally associated with mangrove stands. So most of the islands where we find large archaic populations, they're in the mangroves. Why? They're hunter-gatherers. In a mangrove stand, you find a massive concentration of food. You've got fish, shellfish, birds, reptiles, crabs. You've got an enormous amount of food concentrated at one eco-niche. So they really concentrated on mangroves. But Ceiba doesn't have much in the way of mangroves. So Ceiba posed a little bit more of a complicated problem for the archaic peoples. And one of the main sites, we found 2 sites. One is at Fort Bay, which would have been sea access. But the other one is a site named Plum Peace. Now, Plum Peace site is about 400-meter elevation above Well Bay. It's Mr. Carl Sagers actually first identified the site. It's his property. He had found some artifacts up there. He brought them down. This is a wonderful picture provided by Will Johnson. I don't know if he's here this evening. But when Carl brought down to his office as a commissioner at the time and said, I found these artifacts. Well, Leiden University then got involved and said, well, we need to do a research. And Minnow Hoagland, Corrine Hoffman, James Johnson, of course, was always there as one of the main guides and assistants to the project, started to do a research at Plum Peace. So in 2001 and 2002, they conducted excavations at the site, found a lot of artifacts, and it established something different in the region. With all that previous theory structure that Archaic Age was all about the mangroves, Saba has now posed the position that Archaic peoples also adapted to higher elevations and other niches. Now then, the next wave of people coming into the Caribbean region, and these next waves are all coming from South America, sort of waving in migrations into the Caribbean region. This time period, technological development, is called the Ceramic Age. It means that they are using agriculture and they know the production of ceramics. So for archaeology, when we see the artifacts, the ceramics, we know we're talking about this time period. They also come in with complex social, political, religious systems. They're living in villages and settlements. These are much larger population groups coming in. As you can see, they have constructed houses. So they have become, in our comparison to environment, the archaic peoples were very dependent on nature for their survival and shelter, whereas the Ceramic Age peoples have become more independent. They are creating their own shelters, and they're producing agriculture, which affects the environment, but it also changes the relationship between humans and the environment. Excuse me. Now here is just some ethnographic analogies, some shots of the Yanomami groups in the Orinoco headwater areas. That is the source area all the way back for the peoples who were coming out into the Caribbean in the Ceramic Age. Prolific tool makers, agriculturalists, maize and manioc were the staple crops, and they were very much riverine adapted peoples. What we get in the very first migration, the earliest Ceramic Age migration, is coming from South America out of the Orinoco River, reaching Puerto Rico by about 200 BC, but we have a site in St. Martin that goes all the way back to 300 BC. So this is very early. These people are very much riverine adapted peoples. What we're seeing is when they come into the islands, they don't really bother stopping at islands that don't have rivers. They stop at the bigger islands where they can go into rivers, they go upstream the rivers, and then they establish settlements inland and at different locations. So their ecological adaptation is still very much riverine, even though they've come into an island and Caribbean coastal type of environment. These are the kinds of ceramics that are typical of this very early group. It's often called the Wacoid period because the type of ceramics are identified at the Loaca site near Puerto Rico. Very ornate materials, as I said, the very large sites that we found in St. Martin, but we did not find the Wacoid period, the earliest ceramicists here in Saba yet. Probably because there were not rivers. Now, the next migration, and you kind of really, these first three waves really are physical waves of people coming out of the Orinoco River and migrating and expanding north through the islands. This wave, called the Saladoid, 300 BC to 300 AD, this wave is spectacular. These are large populations of people coming in large canoes that could be constructed in the Orinoco Basin because they have large trees. They are full-blown agriculturalists with very complex societal structure. We see large villages They tend to be shifting more to the coast instead of the inland sites. Now they're more coastal oriented, so they look for good agricultural soils in a good beach protected bay area. Beautiful ceramics, very ornate, beautiful ceramics, very complex social religious systems, because they have a lot of these other artifacts, beads and amulets. These are examples of shell tools, adzes and axes of stone and shell. Just for you to know the difference between an adze and an axe, and we find both in the prehistoric context. An axe is like what you think of as an axe or a hatchet. The blade is vertical compared to the shaft. So you cut like this. An adze, the blade is turned perpendicular to the shaft so that you cut like a hoe. And it's very useful in making canoes. You take a large tree trunk, and with an adze, you can gouge out the middle of the canoe and dig down. You wouldn't be able to do it as easily with an axe. So they had two different types of tools, and it's based on the bevel of the edge. Now, a third migration, which is kind of a full-blown extension of the Saladoid, is called the Barrancoid. It is also larger populations coming in and establishing larger villages. The reason we separate them into two groups of migrations is because there is a clear change in ceramic styles. And that indicates a different cultural pattern. So it's a different group that has come in. But basically a lot of the other things, such as their maize manioc diet and things like that, are consistent. Both Saladoid and Barrancoid sites have been identified at Spring Bay and at Kelby's Ridge. So that area, Spring Bay, and don't forget that of the three main freshwater sources, Spring Bay is one of the big ones for fresh water. That would have been attractive as a location for settlement. But Spring Bay and Kelby's Ridge area, we can say for the ceramic age, really was the early focus on this island. Now, and then at around 600 to 1500 AD, you stop getting these waves coming up from South America, because you've already got a pretty substantial population that has come onto the different islands in the Caribbean. And what you then start getting are more localized cultural developments. Ceramic styles change to be more localized art styles. Settlement patterns tend to be more localized. So we're getting a new formation of localized developments. What we see on Saba is sites at the bottom at St. John's and Spring Bay, dating between 800 and 1200 AD. In the early part of this localized development phase of prehistoric development, the earliest group was actually from the Eastern Caribbean. And then the later half of this phase, I think it's the next slide, comes from the Greater Antilles, which is the Taino, eventually becomes the Taino cultural sphere. So in this localized development, Saba is at this threshold right between the Eastern Caribbean and the Greater Antilles in such a way that it was getting influences from both sides. Even as small as it is, it was a strategic location between the two localized development areas. Again, these types of sites are found at places like Spring Bay, Kelby's Ridge. This little artifact here is a beautiful, classic, probably one of the most famous artifacts of Saba prehistory. It was found at Spring Bay. It is a carved bone fish amulet found by Hoagland and Hoffman in their research. But it's nice to have these kind of iconic artifacts that really sort of represent the prehistoric cultures on the island. Now, into the later period, 1400 to 1500 AD, then we start seeing these island Carib migrations. They're coming up from northeastern South America. They're Carib speaking. The earlier groups were Arawakan speaking. One thing that's often a confusion, Arawak is a language family, not a tribal group. Carib is a language family, not a tribal group. Island Carib became known as a group, but the difference was the language base that they spoke, Caribbean or Arawakan. Okay, what we do see is the Caribs came into the area. That's when we get a first Amerindian name for Ceiba, Amonhana. Amonhana is the Carib word for the island of Ceiba. Now, and then there's this contact period, when the Europeans start coming into the region. One of the things that a lot of people always think about contact, and they think of it as a one-way thing, where the Europeans were coming and showing all the Amerindians all these new things. But in fact, it was really quite balanced. Yes, the Europeans were coming and showing Amerindians a lot of new things that they had never seen before. But the Amerindians were showing the Europeans a lot of new things that they had never seen before either. And just to give you sort of a rundown, the things that were coming from Europe that the Amerindians didn't have: iron, brass, glass, horses, cows, sheep, chickens, the honeybee, coffee, rice, wheat, cabbage, lettuce, citrus, olives, and most importantly, disease. The single most factor that wiped out Native Americans was not cannons, was not swords, was not based on gunpowder. It was based on disease. They didn't have the antibodies and the resistance. Europe at the time was just a cesspool of disease. It was a compressed human population into a small, dense areas with no real sanitation systems. So when they came over, they brought with them several diseases that had an enormous impact, swine flu being one of the big ones. But what the Amerindians were introducing back, and this is what's good to understand as a balance of the two cultures. The hammock, such a logical thing, such a simple thing as the hammock. But can you imagine, before the New World, even in the ships that they were building in Europe, they wouldn't use hammocks to sleep in. They would sleep on wooden plank beds. And can you imagine shifting around and I mean, it would have been crazy trying to sleep in these ships. Once they got the hammock, well, then all of a sudden they caught on. Hey, this works good in these ships. And so something as simple as that became strategic among the Europeans. The turkey, corn, potato, tomato, chili peppers, cacao, vanilla, beans, squash, pumpkin, manioc, avocado, peanuts, pecans, cashews, tobacco, guava, pineapple. And then an ironic twist, as the Europeans were introducing diseases, there was a disease that was all across the tropics of the world. It was called malaria. And it was inhibiting the European ability to conquest these areas in the tropics, because malaria was wiping out their populations. It was the Native Americans who introduced them to quinine. Quinine holds back or fights against malaria. So once they introduced the Europeans to quinine, they gave them the very tool to continue to conquer in the tropical regions. So an ironic twist there. So enslavement, genocide of the natives of the region. The Europeans actually brought a very significant impact on the environment, because they were introducing plantation systems. And plantation systems mean large land clearing and a lot more impact on the environment. Now, into Ceiba, a little early historical period. I can't remember when we started, so I'm on go. Give me a little buzz when I get 5 minutes. In the earliest of the historical period on Ceiba, we're really talking about small family agricultural plots. There wasn't large-scale plantation impact on the island. There were more small plots. The first archaeological excavations were in 1923 by a man named Jocelyn de Jong. There's a picture of the excavations in 1923 in the bottom. I myself did the first island-wide archaeological survey in 1983. And then there has been other archaeological work more recently by Ryan Esperson, who's right here, an archaeologist from Canada who is now working at the Sacred Heart School, at the high school. He did excavations at the Mary Point, Palmetto Point site, in which is a very interesting and important element of Ceiba history, understanding how that community survived, basically in isolation, in its own world for quite a few generations. And so what Ryan was able to do was not only do archaeology to research the site, but he also started getting more youth involved. And I think, is that Marlene? Are you in that picture there? Maybe, or in one of the next ones. So this is the beginning, and what we want to continue with, I'll mention later, is getting more youth involved in heritage research and archaeology. Into the 20th century historical times, some nice old shots, and I really would like to thank Will Johnson for making public a lot of his archives of photographs. I thought it was so unique to have that National Geographic article from 1940, but now I see them in all the shops and everywhere, so everybody has that reference. So, one of the things I wanted to point out with this early historical period on Ceiba is population fluctuations. And one of the things I want to mention tonight when we're talking about environmental impact is Ceiba has gone through a series of fluctuations where, starting with small populations, rising in 1915 to a very large population, and then going back down primarily as a result of the Aruba and Curacao oil refineries. A lot of men left in those years. And then it's coming back up again. Now it's over 2,000 again. The difference is, and this relates to environmental impact and cultural continuity, this peak was a peak of Sabins living on the island. The new peak has a far larger population of immigrants, and non-Sabins are part of the population. So that's having an effect on the cultural development and expressions on the island as well. Some other very nice shots that relate to daily life. Cassava bread drying on the roof there. Obviously, hat work with the Lindsay family, lace work. That sense of strong community spirit. Ceiba has always had a very strong community spirit. Sometimes there are squabbles between groups on the island. Yes, that's with anywhere. But still there has always been that strong sense of pride as Sabin for the Sabin people. Now, another core aspect of Sabin culture has always been the relationship with nature. The culture and the nature have always been tied together. Almost every household had, or still has in many cases, a little agricultural plot. A lot of fishing and boat building was a part of that core cultural development. Fishing has declined substantially at this point, but it's still identified with, the sea is identified strongly with Ceiba culture. You see boat building, you see agricultural plots here. Now into the later 20th century, we get the introduction of the new vehicles, new technologies are being introduced. Of course, vehicles are being imported by sea. But then the building of the airport, 1959, you probably have seen some of these pictures. They were somewhere at the airport. This is when they had a seaplane in the 1960s. But what we're basically getting into the late 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, changing jobs, new technologies, more houses and tourism, all are changing the Ceiba lifestyle. There's less local agriculture, and then there came a dependency on foreign imports. With a larger population also comes the need for more land. And the need for more land has caused the environment to suffer more under the growing populations on Ceiba. Now, the second part I want to talk about here is the excavations we did in April of this year at the family plot where the graves of Thomas and Catherine Holm were identified. It's a site called the Breadline site. And I was invited by the Peterson family, Stanley Peterson, Eddie Peterson and family. They were going to develop the site, and they said, we want to properly deal with the few graves that are there. We want to properly remove them and have them reburied with respect in the cemetery. So they invited me in to do this research. The first thing, of course, was to get the permission from the Holm family. So discussions were had and held with the Holm family that approval was given to do these exhumations. Thomas Holm, he was the acting lieutenant governor of Ceiba from 1898 to 99, and then again appointed the acting lieutenant governor in 1908. The man himself is this gentleman right here. Big beard, smaller fellow. Now, he was a real jack of all trades. This man was practicing dentistry, he was a vesper at the Anglican Church, he was busy here, busy there. He was a real dynamic man doing a lot of different things. This is the breadline site when we were doing the research, and there's a great shot where the word breadline, the whole, why you call it the breadline site, it was in the later 20th century, it became a spot along a wall there where gentlemen would sit and wait to look for work for the day. So they would wait there in order to get a job for the day, make some money, and thus be able to buy bread. So it was kind of an interesting little side story that goes with it. It's a great shot of the gentleman there. Now, I want to give appreciation to several people who I sat down with and did oral history interviews with and talked to and found out about the research that was done, we were doing. Particularly Will Johnson, who has been amazing with his archives and collection of historical data and information. Mr. Frank Hassel, historian for the Anglican Church. He had a lot of very interesting information. Particularly Miss Helen Peterson, sitting right here. I'm so glad you're here today, Helen. Not only the matriarch for the Peterson family, but truly an amazing woman. I mean, she hikes this hill every day, and she's clear, and she has a lot of information about history. I really thank you, Helen, for all the contribution. Also, an interesting gentleman, some of you may know, some of you may not, Alex Heiliger. Lives in the Ballin. Alex, together with Eric Cornet, has been the grave digger for Saba for the last 40 years. That's what he does. He's the grave digger. Now, I'm studying graves, and I, of course, want to talk to the grave digger. Alex turned out to be an amazing volume of information about how it was done in the past, how it's done today, and the whole process. So Alex was really a very important source. And then my two colleagues, Grant Gilmore and Joanna Gilmore from Statia, also came over and helped when we did the archaeology. So another reason we did this archaeology project was because since 10-10-10, we now have certain laws or policies that are being applied, and one of them is called the Malta Convention. Malta Convention was ratified by Holland in 92 and by the Netherlands Antilles in 2007. It was taken over into Saba via that, but now after 10-10-10 is fully applicable. What the Malta Convention basically states, it's for the preservation and proper care of cultural heritage in the world, archaeological and cultural heritage. What it means is that if a developer wants to develop a piece of land, first of all, they have to sponsor an archaeological investigation of that land. And if particular parts of the property are deemed important, they can either be protected or they can be mitigated, which means excavated out and investigated. So this actually, the breadline research that we've done is really one of the first actual applications of the Malta Convention on Saba. Now what's really important about the Malta application here is that we are now involving developers also in the archaeology process. So it's about showing respect for doing the research, getting the information, and understanding the heritage of Saba. What we want to do is take it the next step further. And again, the Breadline Project is being a good a model for this. What we want to do is now make sure that Saba heritage themes and Saba heritage are put as a priority in development plan concepts. It's important that as the island develops, Saba heritage remains one of the cornerstones and pillars of the development aesthetic. Now, just as a general comparison of some of the graves, we're going to talk about graves now for the last little bit. I wanted to show you some different types of graves. I do want to point out that Renee Van Veen, right here, is doing an enormous detailed study of graves, so I do not presume to know near as much as Renee on this. But I want to point out to you some general things that you can understand when you're walking around Ceiba. One of the things that you first need to know, in 1919, Payday 1919 number 21, when they were establishing burial laws in the colony of Curaçao, in what is the Netherlands colonies, all of the islands were established with laws that said all dead should be buried in cemeteries, official designated areas. Ceiba stood up and said, no, we have different cultural traditions, and we want to be able to maintain a distinctive burial right within our yards, within private yards. They were granted that. So since 1919, Ceiba is the only island that has the right to bury in the yard compared with the other islands in the Netherlands Antilles. But let's look at some of these types of graves that we're looking at. A lot of the older graves, among the oldest are these dome-type structures. What you're looking for when you're kind of breaking it into general categories of age of graves, 18th century to early 20th century, you see cut stone graves, and you can see the cut stone with the mortar between them. And then into the mid-20th century, you start seeing these ones that are open cement. So it's a mold cement. Alex Heiliger built many of these, and so he was able to explain to me how he built them. Some of them, of course, have marble inlay with them. And then after the mid-20th century, a lot of the more modern graves are looking like this, with these ceramic tiles being put over the cement. So just as a general reference, you can see the older ones are these dome shapes, the stone mortar kind of cut stone graves, the cement, open cement graves, and then the tile graves. That gives you just a quick reference of a frame period. One of the things that's unique, and we're going to see now the series of excavations of the first graves actually archaeologically excavated on Ceiba, is they are so unique. I have excavated more than 60 graves in the Caribbean region, and I have never seen grave burial techniques like is here on Ceiba. And it occurred in all 5 of the graves. So it is a Ceiba tradition that is extremely unique. I'm looking and looking and looking, trying to find this technique. It involves having a stone-lined chamber covered with a cap, either large stones or a larger capstone. One area that does use chambers with capstones is in Scotland. Now we're going to go over the very specifics of the 5 graves that we excavated at the breadline site. This one is Anne Catherine Home. The headstone was there. It still had her name on it. We knew it was her. Born 1853, died in 1927. When we lifted off the gravestones, it will be incorporated into the project as part of a heritage display with artifacts and information about heritage of the site. Thanks to Will Johnson, I know that the father was James Hassel, and the mother we know was Catherine. This is the mother of Ida Home, who is the grandmother of Glenn Home. I don't know if it's Glenn here tonight. But what we found, and what I want you to look at, as we lifted the headstones off, we took off the first 50 centimeters, and then you start seeing these piles of stone. These stones were the backfill into the pit that they had dug for the burial. What you do see that's unique, and you're going to see this over and over, the next slide is even better. Well, what you do see is that you see the stone-lined chamber at the bottom, and you can see it very clearly here. See the stone lining? And then these large capstones covering that. That means that when they put the box into this space and put the capstones over it and filled it in, it remained air. They didn't get packed in with dirt like normal graves, and then everything is set in soil. It actually decomposed in air. And so when we look at the box, for example, it's a little bit less clear. I think it's more clear on some of the others. You can see the nails from the box as they just sort of fell to the sides as it was decomposing. With Catherine, we found some interesting objects. I have put a couple out if you're interested later. A tortoiseshell comb was in her hair. Her hair was still somewhat, fragments were present. She had a bright red colored hair. And we found in her hand, right at her waist, a Book of Common Prayer. It had so heavily decomposed, but there was a small bit of gold inlay that we could see the title of the book. So we knew that it was an Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Now, as we move to Thomas's burial, which is right next to her, then we can see this technique even better. You see, Catherine's grave has already been opened and she's been removed. Now we're going down and taking down for Thomas's. We see again these large capstones, and then when we open it up, there he is in an open space at the bottom. With his burial, and these stones, these capstones, are really big stones. They're heavy, flat, large stones. We had to lift 2 men to lift these things out. I had a nice conversation with Mr. Guy Johnson, and he told me as a boy he remembers that the men would sometimes spot a particular stone that was the right size and shape to use for burials, and they would put them at a certain place aside. They would keep those stones aside. So they were already planning for that kind of preparation. Within Thomas's grave, we found a lot of ornamental tin work, these ornamental tin plates that were tacked on the box. And with the handles, I have a fragment of one of the handles here. And so this technique is so absolutely unique. Next. Okay, grave 3 was a child, less than 1 year old. We don't know the gender. We didn't find many artifacts with it. We think it was probably a child of Thomas and Catherine because it was buried right next to them. Grave 4 was away from the rest of the burials. It was a little bit later. It's early 20th century. The same technique with the capstones and the lining. This is believed to be perhaps Thomas's brother, Reginald, and so we're trying to look into that more. It was a male, an adult male. And then grave 5, which we believe is the mother of Thomas, because she is right beside Thomas and his wife in a parallel line. This burial dates to mid-19th century, and it's an adult female. We can, of course, the artifacts, we can date it very clearly. You can see there was Catherine, there was Thomas, and this is where we believe is Eleanor Hassel, the mother of Thomas. You can see again, we're excavating the third one, the capstones. There she is. One very interesting thing that she had is, you see here, that right there and that right there. You can see them clearly here. Can you see my little dots? This woman, buried in the mid-19th century, an adult woman, had shoes on her feet, because we find the little brass laces. So we know she had shoes on her feet, but they had put a pair of shoes on her chest. In case she into the next world there. I think that it might relate to the fact, this is mid-19th century. For those of you who don't know, in the 18th century, Saba was famous for shoemaking. Saba, there are historical records that say almost every Saban makes shoes. So Saba was famous for shoemaking in the 18th century. It may be that either somebody made these for her, or they were some very special shoes that she had made or meant something to her, but the shoes themselves would have had a Saban cultural tradition that were tied, that they wanted to bury them with her. So I think that's a very interesting object to have found in this context. Now, these are the other types of things I have. Like I say, I have some out here. Ceramics were by far the most common type of artifact. But for archaeologists, we love ceramics. Because ceramics are made in certain styles for certain time periods at certain places. So once we find them, we can date and control where the artifacts were coming from and what time periods. We have metal objects, glass objects. You can see a lot of these here. Medicine bottles, ornamental bottles, inkwells, wine bottles. Some of the more unique artifacts that we found, again, they're up here. Some hand-carved wood from a piece of furniture. An interesting St. Eustatius stamped coin, see the SE, from the late 18th century. Buttons made out of shell, bone, glass, metal. Even these discs here it's an old button technique. They would take a ceramic, grind it into a disc, wrap it with cloth, tie it at the back, and it became a button. We also find metal objects. We find a piece of a gun mechanism here. I can never get this. There we go. We found slate, which means writing was going on. And we also find these kaolin pipes. Some of them are unique. I'll show you the next. And this is funny. Thomas Holm, being that man of all trades, who was acting lieutenant governor, he was also the acting dentist on the island. He also was well known for having fixed broken bones, and he was an all-around leader of the community. In the trash pile next to his remains there, we're finding extracted teeth. These are human teeth, but they are not just teeth that fell out. They were intentionally chiseled, broken, to be pulled out and extracted, and then thrown out on the trash. Curiously, when I let a specialist look at these, not only are they intentionally extracted, both of these teeth are from the same individual. So he kind of said it's a 2-for-1 sale here, you know. I'll take this one out, we'll take the other one out with it, kind of thing. But interesting example in the artifacts of how we know about the life of the people who were there. Here are some interesting ones. In terms of those clay pipes, the old kaolin clay pipes, Peter Dorney in the 18th century was a real famous German pipe maker. Everybody seemed to like the pipes, so everybody started copying them. And Dorney himself in Germany stops making pipes in the 18th century, but in England and Holland, they keep making Peter Dorney pipes because the brand name was so good, it would sell the pipe if they put that name on it. So what we found here is a 19th century Dutch copy of this type of pipe. This one has imprinted on the side, Glasgow. Again, another tie to Scotland. And I'm more and more, I mean, of course we all know there is that sentiment of Scottish heritage on Saba, but in the archaeological record we're actually finding more and more support for that cultural influence. We also find things in the silver work. We can find the marks. This is silverware made from Dublin, post-1945. Food remains, we can see what they're eating. We're seeing cow, we're seeing goat, we're seeing a lot of fish, we're seeing some birds. Some American technical imports like these insulators for electricity, that's much later, 20th century. And then we have this interesting porcelain doll that we found. We found two pieces of it, the body and the arm. Now, a normal 19th century doll of this type has on the back printed Nippon. They were made in China, and of course, Nippon is the word for Japanese, not China, in Japan. Nippon is the word for Japan. And so they were printed. But the Americans, from 1914 to 1923, started printing the word Japan on the back of the dolls. So that's how we know a date on this particular doll that we got from the site. Finding things like dolls, finding things like exclusive types of goblets and rather wealthy drinking bottles. Yeah. We're seeing a lifestyle. We know there were children there. We have inkwells and slate, so we know there was education and writing there. Okay, so in closing up, when we look through the human inhabitation of Saba, we can look through these changes in the relationship. In the Archaic Age, those very first humans, minimal impact on the environment because they are dependent on the environment. Into the Ceramic Age, we see very localized impact on the environment where agricultural plots, Spring Bay, Kelbridge Ridge, in the bottom, places like that. Even in the early historical period, we're only seeing localized impact. household family plots in areas like that. It's not large-scale agricultural or land clearing. But into the Middle End period, historic period, then we start seeing a lot more new technologies. We see a lot of growing populations, and we see changing needs. More houses and more roads, more vehicles, more roads. So we see an increased impact on the environment. Where we are now is that we have reached a large non-indigenous population, a lot more cars and vehicles, a lot more technology, a lot more houses, and with the tourism infrastructure, more people coming to the island. So we have a far more significant impact on the environment in the modern context. Now, into the future, where can we go? First and foremost, we need to maintain respect for Saba culture. And that means in development projects, incorporate heritage themes in a lot of your projects. But it means respecting culture, customs, allowing for scientific research, but doing it in a way to maintain a sustainable type of development. And we also are working towards forming SABARC, the Saba Archaeological Center, where we can involve the youth more in conducting archaeological research, basic data collection, and things like that. So those are two directions we can go in towards the future. I want to spell special thanks to the Sea&Learn organizers of this event. Thank you very much. I would like to say thank you to Stanley, Barbara, Kian, Eddie, Yvette, and Helen Peterson, the Peterson family. I would like to say thank you to the Governor of Saba, Governor Jonathan Johnson. I would really like to thank Will Johnson, Frank Hassel, Helen Peterson, Alec Taylor, James Johnson, and Mikhail Buchan for their contribution.